So we've got some shocking news coming out of the payroll report. And even if you saw the specific numbers, I'm going to reveal some data that nobody is talking about that's going to blow you away. So sit down, buckle up, definitely stiff drink time. So let's shoot straight over to the first story here, Wall Street Journal. And the headline here, hiring slows but remains solid. So if you didn't hear, the expected was 169,000 new jobs for the establishment survey. And we clocked in this morning at 143. So about 20,000 fewer than was expected. But the unemployment rate actually went from 4.1 down to 4.0. Now, initially, I thought this was because labor force participation must have declined, and that actually wasn't it. The labor force participation was the exact same. So you say to yourself, well, George, how is this possible when the expectation was for 4.1 and we had fewer jobs created, but the unemployment rate actually went down? And this is why interest rates, let's say on the 10-year, were up today, because they actually saw this as rather hawkish, because you combine this with wages went up slightly more than expected. And that's why the 10-year treasury, it was up maybe 4 or 5 basis points last time I looked at it. But I think that's going to reverse very quickly once the reality sinks in. And the reality that I'm talking about is the reason the unemployment rate went down is because they finally started to include all of the illegal immigration into the numbers. Now, if you're new to the channel, let me back up here. And this is something that I've been talking about since the Sahm rule was triggered. And most of you know the Sahm rule is just basically a 50 basis point increase in the unemployment rate over the past, the trailing 12 months. And it's a little more to it than that, but it's kind of like a moving average, but that's the broad strokes. So the Sahm rule was triggered, and a lot of people out there on FinTwit, especially a lot of these experts, will say, oh, this is just fake news. The Sahm rule, we should just completely ignore it, because the reason why unemployment went up is because of all the illegal immigrants. We've got a lot more illegal immigrants than jobs, and therefore when you include the Hispanics or wherever they're coming from into the number, well, that's why the Sahm rule was triggered. And I came out and said, whoa, no, that's not true, because the illegal immigrants were not included in the unemployment data, because the last year's unemployment data they used was 2022. So you can't say that the 50% increase, or excuse me, the 50 basis point increase was a result of data that hadn't even been included into the report. So now the report goes from 2022, as far as taking the census data, from 2022 to 2023. So it still doesn't include all the illegals that came into the United States during 2024, which was not a zero number, as you guys know. But let's get into the specifics here. This is where it's really kind of stiff drink time. And this is the data you're not going to find on any other channel. And I don't know why, because it doesn't take that long just to read the fine print and connect the dots. But that's why you guys tune in to the Rebel Capitalist channel. So let's do that right now. We're going to go to the BLS website. And this is just the report they came out with this morning, 8:30 Eastern time. And all the way at the bottom, they talk about the adjustments to population estimates for the household survey. And this is where they go over the specific numbers of illegals or immigrants, whatever, that they included into this report that has not been included in the reports that triggered the Sahm rule. Okay. Now, actually, I'm getting a little ahead of myself. Before we get to this, let's go back to 2024. And this is Market Watch, where they are talking about a report from Goldman Sachs. Just so you know, this isn't just George talking here. This was Goldman Sachs saying, hey, the unemployment rate isn't accurate, but it isn't necessarily too low. It might be too high. Let me read it to you right from Market Watch here. The U.S. unemployment rate would be higher if the full impact of immigration, much of it illegal, were included, according to a new report from Goldman Sachs. Again, this is going back to 2024. The household survey used in the calculation of unemployment relies on a population estimate from the census as a benchmark. And that estimate is based on 2022. So all the immigration that we had in 2023, 2024, when it was in overdrive, was not included in this. So again, when the Sahm rule was triggered, that didn't include all of the people crossing the border because Joe Biden was giving them a free credit card with $10,000 on it and putting them up in a 4-star hotel in New York City. in New York City. So let's get back to it. As a result, the labor force should be 1.1 million higher, because again, it's not including the illegals, and the unemployment or the employment numbers, the people who have jobs, should be 1 million higher. So their hypothesis was there was about 100,000 job delta there, meaning there was 1.1 million more people in the labor force and 1 million jobs that had not been included. Therefore, there would be 100,000 additional people that were unemployed that were part of the labor force. That's what Goldman Sachs was getting at. And let's see, let me read the last sentence here. The official data, the Goldman economists, should be reconciled in January of 2025, as far as the report that just came out today, which will incorporate information from the new 2023 community survey. So again, even the numbers that we're seeing now, it's not like they're adjusted to February 2025. They're just adjusted through 2023. There's quite a lag on this stuff. And again, 2024, as you guys know, was a big year for illegals coming over to get their free stuff from Joe Biden and the Democrats. So now let's get back to the BLS and the specific numbers they use to calculate. And now what actually turned out was the opposite. You see, Goldman thought there'd be 1.1 million new people and only 1 million jobs, therefore an additional 100,000 unemployed people. But when you look at the BLS survey, it was the exact opposite, which is just one of the many head scratchers when you start looking through the details of what they're saying. This makes absolutely zero sense, no sense whatsoever. So I'm taking that 4% number with a grain of salt. And here's what I'm talking about. This year's adjustment was large relative to adjustments in past years, right? And the next year is going to be even larger because we probably had more illegals coming in 2024 than we did in 2023. It reflects both updated methodology. You always wonder when they change the methodology. That's always like the CPI. And new information about net international migration in recent years. And that's the politically correct way of saying it. Table B shows the adjustment increased the estimate size of civilian non-institutional population age 16 and over in December by 2.9 million. 2.9 million. Now, how many of you think that there were only 2.9 million people that crossed the border in 2023 for Joe Biden's free stuff? 2.9 million? I would, at the very least, double it. But let's keep going. The increases in population were relatively large for Asians and Hispanics. No surprise there, especially with the Hispanics. But what is a surprise, and quite frankly, completely unbelievable, is the other demographic they didn't mention here. More on that in just a moment. The adjustments increased the total civilian labor force by 2.1 million. So, you figure there's 700,000 or so people that are old or too young to work, whatever, including increases of 2 million in the employment and 105,000 in the unemployment. Okay, the number of people not in the labor force increased by 765,000. That's them looking at, okay, this 2.9 million, and then I'm assuming that they're subtracting the approximate 800,000 for the people that are too young or too old to be considered in the quote-unquote labor force. Although the effect on the levels was relatively large, the effect on rates and ratios was small. The adjustment increased the total unemployment rate, employment population ratios, and labor force participation by 0.1% each. What they're saying here is that's how they're taking the unemployment rate from 4.1% down to 4%. Now, let's just go back and read this part because this is very important. The adjustment increased the total civilian labor force by 2.1 million. Okay, got it. Including increases of 2 million in unemployment. The 100,000 number is consistent with Goldman Sachs, what they predicted back in 2024, that you'd have an additional 105,000 with the unemployment. Now, first, and I'm no statistician here, but if I'm reading this correctly, you tell me how labor force participation stays the exact same, because up higher, they said it's the exact same. Yet the unemployment number goes up by 105,000, and yet the unemployment rate goes down. Okay, maybe I'm missing something, but right off the bat, that doesn't really pass the old sniff test. But it gets much, much worse. First of all, like I said earlier, you're telling me that only 2.9 million came over? And check this out. They actually break the 2.9 million down by ethnicity. And here's the kicker. Of the 2.9 million that they said came across the border, or, new immigration, basically illegals, right? They're saying 1.4 million were white people. Now, I have not been to the Mexican border in quite some time, but my guess is that it wasn't 50% white people coming over. And even if you want to say, well, okay, maybe the white people are coming over from the Canadian border, this includes all immigration. Okay, fine. But now you've got to subtract that number from the amount of Latinos coming over. And when you subtract the Asian and the Latinos, they're saying only 1.2 million came over in 2023. 1.2 million? I mean, come on. Who are you trying to kid? Maybe 1.2 million per month. I mean, that makes sense. But 1.2 million for the entire year? I don't think so. I mean, just the people I employ, just the Venezuelans I employ, know probably at least 10 or 12 people that went across the Darien Gap and up through Mexico and crossed the border because of Joe Biden's freebies. Just the people that I employ know 10 or 12 people. You're telling me 1.2 million total? This is utter nonsense. And then to make matters even more ridiculous, absurd, you're telling me that out of all the people that came over here, what you say are, let's just in the labor force, 2.1 million people. You're telling me that only 100,000 of them didn't have a job? This is complete nonsense. I mean, just again, does this pass the sniff test? There were 100,000 people just in New York that didn't have a job. And people, I'm talking about illegal immigrants, let alone 100,000 people out of all the individuals that came across the southern border. You're telling me that only 5% of those people didn't get a job? 5%. Try 50%. And again, this goes back to some insider information I have, because I have so many people that work for me that know Venezuelans that went up through the Darien Gap, through Mexico, across the border. And I can assure you that out of those 10 or 12 people, 0 of them have, well, maybe a couple of them got a job. So you say maybe 10% of those people got a job. You say, well, why, George? They were able-bodied. Well, sure. They don't have any skills. That's why they couldn't get a job in Colombia, because they had no skills. But in the United States, they have even fewer skills, because at least in Colombia, they spoke the language, where in the United States, they don't even speak English. So how many of these? So let's think about this. These people are totally uneducated. They don't understand the culture. They don't understand the work ethic. Not saying that they have a lesser work ethic, but it's just different, right? They don't understand, like as an example, everyone in South America is late. Always, 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 always. That's what I'm talking about. So they don't understand, they don't have that skill set, that on-time skill set that gringos and Europeans have. It's just not hardwired into their brain. So you look at all these things that they have against them, right? And you're telling me that only 5% of them did not have a job? Give me a break. This is just straight propaganda. I mean, this is almost absurd as some of the things that they were trying to get you to believe during the cerveza sickness. I mean, this is at that level. Again, first and foremost, you're telling me only 1.2 million Hispanics came over in 2023. Yeah, right. And then you're telling me out of that group, only 5% of them didn't get a job. Yeah, right. And so let's just assume, and again, I don't know why the amount of unemployed people go up by 100,000, like Goldman accurately called, and then somehow the unemployment rate goes down. But let's assume that's part of their methodology, right? But the real number is not 105. Let's just go through this and do some back of the napkin math using some common sense here. on what are likely more accurate numbers. So first and foremost, let's do 10 million Latinos, not 1.2. And then out of that, how many of those people are working? Let's be generous and say 75%. Okay. Well, that gives us 2.5 million additional people unemployed. 2.5 million additional people unemployed. Okay. Well, then if 100,000 has basically no impact, well, then what does 2.5 million have? Obviously, that takes the unemployment rate up to 4.6789. Now, to be very fair, I don't know that I would actually use that as an indicator for the Sahm rule. In other words, the Sahm rule right now, it's still triggered at 4%. Well, I'd have to go back and look at it because it is a moving average. But let's assume for a moment that it's still triggered. I would not say that, oh my gosh, if you add all of these illegals, let's just say 2.5 million we're talking about, that this takes the unemployment rate up to 4.8, and therefore the Sahm rule is even worse. I don't think that's actually correct. But what I'm talking about is just the overall unemployed and the employment numbers being totally, ridiculously bogus for anyone that takes the 30 seconds to just simply look under the hood. These numbers that we're getting, it's just, and the revisions, by the way, were 818,000. You guys know that for 2024. And then the final revisions took it down to like 550. But even that is very close to the highest levels since the GFC as far as the revisions. And at a certain point, even based on their methodology, we're having to revise over and over and over. And each revision is so extreme. You would think at some point they've got to look at themselves and say, you know what, maybe our models are wrong. Or maybe we've been lying so much that we're very close to getting our hand caught in the cookie jar. Because at a certain point, even the normies in the mainstream media have to sit there and scratch their head and say, wait a minute, this doesn't really add up. Like Lacey Hunt. I mean, Lacey Hunt is about as straight and narrow as you can get. But even over the last 6 months or so, he has been questioning the data coming from the government. Even Lacey Hunt, and he used to work at the Dallas Fed. So I think that's a sign of things to come here in 2025. And I don't know, it may get to a point where, it sucks because you would like to assume that the numbers coming from the government are close to accurate. But again, when you start looking under the hood, it's laughable, completely laughable. We're going to have to follow this story. And again, I don't know if that has any economic impact. Like, I don't know that I would say if the unemployment rate went up to 4.8% as a result of that, I don't know that I would increase my probabilities of recession. I want to be very clear there. I'm just going over this story to point out the absurdity of the numbers that are coming out of the BLS. Hello, fellow Rebel Capitalists. Wanted to let you know of a brand new channel I started where I'm going to be interviewing all of your favorites. Lynn Alden, Chris McIntosh, Robert Kiyosaki, Doug Casey, Luke Groman, Brent Johnson, Jeff Snyder, Peter Schiff, Mike Maloney, just to name a few. So to make sure you never miss one of these incredible interviews, you're going to want to click the link in the description right now and subscribe to Rebel Capitalist Interviews. And I will see you on the next video.